My daughter had just told me she was pregnant after 12 years of waiting. I was still crying from happiness when she gently said, "What I mean is, you should sell the house and move down here for good." She said it so softly, so reasonably, but I immediately heard what was wrapped inside that gentleness. They wanted me to become an unpaid nanny for the rest of my life. My name is Mia Sullivan, and that was the moment I understood that joy can sometimes arrive carrying a very sweet cut. If you have ever had a moment when joy and heartbreak hit at the exact same time, stay with me. Maybe somewhere in this story, you will recognize something painfully close to your own life. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. Thomas had been gone a long time, but my body still kept the habit of opening my eyes at the hour he used to go downstairs and heat water. The kitchen was still the same, the dry click of the electric kettle, the smell of French press coffee, and Whitman lying flat beneath the table. Outside, Portland rain fell steadily, the kind of weather that makes people want to fold into themselves and think. My phone lit up, a text from Clara the night before. "Call me as soon as you wake up, Mom. Big news." At 64, my hands still tremble when I see the words "big news" from my child. I tapped the video call button. Clara appeared, her eyes red with tears but her mouth smiling. "Mom, I'm pregnant." "Mom?" Clara's face crumpled, then she laughed out loud. "Did you hear me?" I nodded over and over, my own eyes blurring. "I heard you. I heard you. Oh my God, Clara." 12 years wandering through hospital hallways, prescriptions constantly changing, and hopes that barely sparked before going dark again. 12 years of watching my daughter force out, "It's okay, Mom," in the voice of someone too exhausted to believe her own words. And this morning, the miracle had finally come. Daniel stepped into the frame holding a coffee mug, his shirt collar still open. He still had that steady, polite manner about him, that careful composure that I sometimes found hard to reach. But in that moment, it felt strangely solid. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said. "We were going to wait until we were more sure. But we couldn't keep it a secret anymore." "Thank God," I blurted out, tears blurring the whole screen. Clara lightly placed a hand over her stomach, a trembling little gesture as if she herself still could not believe there was life growing there. "Only 8 weeks, Mom," she said. "But the doctor says everything looks good this time. Really good." We started talking about the future, about little simple things, the kind of normal life we had spent 12 years circling around before finally touching, which made it more precious than any dazzling miracle on earth. "Are you getting morning sickness?" I asked. She said yes, but she could handle it. I asked a few more questions about food, and Clara rolled her eyes exactly the way she had at 16. "Mom, I'm 40. 40 or 14, you're still the girl who forgets to eat when she gets busy." Daniel laughed. Clara laughed. Whitman lifted his head and looked at me like he could not understand why this woman was crying and laughing at 6 in the morning like she had lost her mind. Then the conversation started to turn. Not suddenly, very skillfully, very smoothly. Like a boat slipping through fog so that by the time you realize it, the old shore is already gone. "I keep thinking about having a baby without you nearby," Clara began. My face was still wet with tears on this side of the screen. "I'll come visit more often." Daniel nodded, speaking in that calm voice of his. "Actually, that's something we've been worried about too." "About what?" "You're alone in Portland, Mom," Clara said, her face shifting into a look of serious concern. "The house is too big for you now." My hand froze around the dish towel. She went on, her voice soft, like she was smoothing a wrinkle out of a shirt. "Oregon is too damp and cold. It's not good for your health. And you're all alone there. I'm really not comfortable with that." Daniel jumped in at exactly the right moment, as if he were adding the perfect supporting point to an argument they had already prepared. "The guest house here is fully set up, Mom. Private, comfortable, and the doctors are excellent. If we lived close to each other, everything would be easier for everyone." For everyone. My fingers accidentally brushed the ring of cold water left on the table from last night. That cold snapped me fully awake. Clara's voice kept moving, steady and polished. "You don't need to keep living alone like that. And if you moved down here before the baby comes, everything would be so much easier." I stared at the screen. Easier for who? Both of them paused. It was only a very short silence, but long enough to expose the gap between us, the one they had hoped they could quietly step around. Clara gave a little laugh, acting surprised as if I had questioned something completely obvious. "Easier for all of us, Mom," she said. "What I mean is, you should sell the house and move down here for good. Daniel is so busy, and I'm about to have a baby. The first few years are going to be incredibly hard. If you were here, you wouldn't have to worry about any expenses if you moved down," Daniel added. The picture became perfectly clear. There was no way to pretend not to see it anymore. The role they had made for me was wrapped in lovely words: private guest house, devotion, family togetherness. But at its core, it remained exactly the same: a full-time nanny. No pay, no days off, and if one day I grew tired and wanted to return to Portland, selfish would be stamped across my forehead immediately. I looked at Clara, the child who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after my late shifts at the library, the child I always put the raincoat on first before I put one on myself. My whole life, I had raised her on one phrase: "Let Mom handle it." There was not a trace of malice on her face. That hurt even more. She truly believed this arrangement was love. Part of me wanted to save the morning, wanted to swallow the cold running down my spine, smile, and say, "Let me think about it," just so her happiness would not shatter. That was the old version of me, the woman who had spent 40 years smoothing things over. But I was tired. Strangely, the first no of my life did not come from anger. It came from a deep stillness, as if the part of me that had always surrendered had finally loosened its grip. I set my mug down on the table. "I'm happy for you both. So happy," I said calmly. "But I am not moving to San Jose." Clara blinked. Daniel said nothing. I could see the exact moment she thought I must be joking, or that I simply had not understood yet. She believed that if she explained a little more, I would soften the way I always had. "You mean you're just not ready to decide right now, right?" Clara asked. "No," I said. "I mean no." The screen was still lit, but I felt like an invisible wall had just risen between us. Clara did not yell. She did not cry. She just pulled inward, becoming distant in exactly the way she used to at 19. A silence that made every question and every show of concern from earlier feel pointless. "I thought," she said carefully, "after everything you taught me about family, you would want to be with me right now." I took a slow breath. "I will be with you, but not by selling my house and living according to your plan." "That's not my plan. You've been talking like everything is already arranged. Because I thought you'd be happy." "I'm happy that you're pregnant. That doesn't mean I have to disappear from my own life." Daniel finally spoke, still in the calm voice of a man used to controlling everything through gentleness. "Nobody wants you to disappear. We're just trying to find the best solution." "For who?" I repeated. Clara let out a sharp breath, turned away, then looked straight at me. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling. "I waited 12 years. I'm terrified, Mom, and the first thing you're thinking about is your own life." The words landed like a needle in the softest part of me. Because she was right. She was terrified. I could see it in the way her smile was just a little too bright, in the way she clutched Daniel's coffee mug. But my daughter's fear could not automatically become an obligation for me to hand over the rest of my life. "I'm not turning my back on you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just telling the truth." "The truth is that you don't want to help me?" I didn't say that. "Then what are you saying?" My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Whitman stood up and pressed his head against my calf. That old dog must have smelled something breaking apart, even if he did not know what it was called. I spoke slowly, clearly, one word at a time. "I am not selling my house. I'm not moving to San Jose. I will come visit. I will help as much as I can. But I am not moving there." Clara stared at me. "I never thought," she said, her voice flat in a way that felt frightening, "that you could be this selfish." That sentence stayed in me for months afterward. Nobody said anything else. The call ended in a silence more painful than shouting. Daniel only gave a small nod, the nod of a man who had just lost a negotiation. Clara did not even say goodbye. I stood motionless in the kitchen, gripping the back of a chair. The coffee had gone cold. The rain outside had thinned. Whitman lay down at my feet, calm as if this were just another ordinary day. Inside my chest, two opposite feelings crashed into each other: relief and guilt. Relief, as if I had just set down a burden I had carried so long I had mistaken it for part of my skeleton. But also deep guilt, because it felt like I had just done the cruelest thing possible, not stepping forward when my child called. 3 days passed, and the phone stayed silent. I paced like someone waiting for a sentence to be handed down, not knowing when it would come. I picked up my phone, then put it down again. I made coffee and left it untouched. I read half a page of a book and realized none of the words had gone in. At one point, I typed out a long message. "I'm sorry if what I said hurt you." I stared at it, then deleted it. Then I typed, "I'm still here." Deleted that too. Some apologies are not really apologies. They are just a knock on the door, asking to be let back into the old room, the one where I had to make myself smaller so other people could feel comfortable. My mind knew that. My body still lunged toward the old habit. Nighttime was the worst. Thomas's side of the bed was still flat and cold. I no longer reached across to it every night, but in the dark, I still sometimes had the feeling my hand was about to touch his shoulder. And then there was only emptiness. On the third night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, asking myself something I should have asked years ago. If Thomas were still alive, would he call me selfish? Or would he say I had finally woken up? Thomas was gentle, but his gentleness had a quiet cruelty to it. He never forced me to sacrifice myself. He simply let me do it. When Clara was little and I gave up graduate school because the class schedule clashed with daycare, he said, "Whatever you think is best." When I turned down the position managing the library branch so I could get home earlier for our daughter, he said, "I know you always put Clara first." That sentence was both a compliment and a life sentence. The memories came back in thin, sharp slices. An October afternoon standing in the rain, my own coat soaked because I had taken it off and wrapped it around Clara while she burned with fever. The box of pasta I forgot in the middle of a work shift until it went cold and hard. The college tuition bill taped to the refrigerator with a number so large it made my knees buckle into a chair, only for me to quietly call the bank the next morning and ask for another loan. The words "let mom handle it" had become instinct, easier than breathing. Uniforms, parties, enrollment forms, emergency flights when Clara miscarried the first time. "Let mom handle it" began as love, but once you say it long enough, it turns into doctrine. And anyone who hears you preach it their whole life will eventually believe it is simply the natural order of things. On the 4th day, Whitman slipped out into the yard when I opened the door to get the mail. I panicked and called after him, but he only ran a few yards before stopping by the fence at the neighbor's house. A woman was bending down to tie her shoe, her hair in a loose bun, gloves tucked under one arm. "I'm sorry," I called as I hurried over, slightly out of breath. "He's old, but he still thinks he's young." The woman looked up and smiled. "I noticed." Whitman let me clip the leash back on without a fuss. I was just about to give a polite goodbye when she looked at me more carefully, with a clear, steady gaze that held no nosiness. "Are you okay?" I answered on reflex. "Oh, I'm fine." But my face must have betrayed me. Jasmine tilted her head and said something that made me go still there on the rain-damp step. "You look like you just lost something," she said, "even though it's still right here." Rain fell softly on the porch roof. I could hear a trash bin rattling down the street in the wind. I did not know who she was, and I did not understand how she had named exactly what I had not yet managed to say out loud. My throat tightened. "Would you like to come in for tea?" That was the first time Jasmine stepped into my house. At first, we talked about nothing important. Rosemary plants that kept dying and coming back. Whitman's hatred of leaf blowers. The green glazed teapot I had bought at a flea market 9 years earlier. Harmless little topics people our age use to test whether each other is safe. Jasmine did not push me to open up. She just sat there with her teacup in both hands, sometimes watching the rain run down the window as if time had never once been something chasing her. Then she asked lightly, "When was the last time you made a decision just because you wanted to?" I almost laughed it off, but the question would not drift away. It got stuck somewhere between my chest and the tip of my tongue. The last time. Anything at all. Just because I wanted it for myself. A memory opened and then closed again. Empty. Not because I was deliberately hiding anything, but because there truly was nothing left to remember. My mind was filled only with decisions that were reasonable, responsible, or least likely to hurt anyone. Choices that always had to tuck themselves behind Clara's school schedule, behind Thomas's work, even behind the family budget spreadsheet. And the things that belonged only to me? Gone. Without a trace. Jasmine set her teacup down. That's okay. You don't have to answer right away. Maybe I don't have an answer at all. Then start there. With not remembering anything? With realizing that you forgot. On her way out, Jasmine stood in the doorway, as if casually tossing back a key to me. Try this tonight. Take a piece of paper and divide it into 2 columns. On one side, write the things you had to do. On the other, write the things you once wanted. Once wanted? Yes. Just start with what you used to want. The exercise sounded simple. It wasn't. That night, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the pen scratching across the paper. The left column filled up fast. Take care of the child. Work extra shifts. Drop the class. Borrow money. Cancel the trip. Stay calm. Cook. Fix things. Give in. Wait. The right column stayed blank, white and empty in a way that felt insulting. I sat there a long time, long enough for the tea to go cold and for Whitman to change sleeping positions twice. It was that emptiness that began to scare me. Then an image surfaced, sudden and clear. The coastal highway, salty wind, dark sand after the rain, Cannon Beach. The place Thomas and I used to drive to in the early years of our marriage, before money and children wedged themselves between us. I leaned down and wrote the first line in the right column. I once wanted to live near the ocean. Women can be strange that way. They spend their whole youth lighting the path for other people, and then when the lights go out, they are stunned to realize they are standing in a pitch-dark room, unable to remember the way back to their own dreams. Looking at that sentence, what hit me was not happiness, but sorrow. There are things we give up for so long that by the time we speak their names again, it feels more like a funeral than a reunion. If you've also had a wish left behind for too long, leave a yes in the comments. And stay with me, because this is where the truth really starts to come into focus. In the days that followed, I left the house more often. Not because I felt strong, but because I was afraid the thick air inside those 4 walls would push me back toward the phone, where that old guilty voice would start up again. Your daughter is pregnant, and you're dreaming about the ocean. My slow walks through the Alberta Arts District felt like the steps of someone who had just moved there, even though my life had been tied to Portland for more than 40 years. The worn little shops, the mural of a woman standing among paper birds, the bell over the bookstore door. It all looked strangely unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it for the first time. One truth rose in me like shock. For all those decades, this city had been nothing but a long hallway, the route to work, the road home, the grocery store, the pharmacy. Portland had been there, but my own presence in my own life had not. One morning after the rain stopped, I pushed open the wooden door of the Reading Light bookstore. The place smelled like old paper and warm wood. The young man behind the counter looked up and narrowed his eyes at me, like he was searching his memory. Didn't you used to work at the city library? I blinked. Yes, a long time ago. I knew it. You once helped me track down an out-of-print book of Russian poetry. I was 17, my hair was dyed blue, and everyone looked at me like I was trouble except you. A soft laugh slipped out of me. Too bad I can't remember. That's okay. I do. He held out his hand across the counter. Ethan. It was a short, pleasant conversation, in that rare way some conversations are when no one tries to shove you into a role you're expected to play. Ethan did not ask about family, husband, children, or any of the usual polite interrogations. He only asked what I had been reading lately. A novel I had left half-finished at home came to mind, but Ethan cut in before I could say it. No, I mean your real taste. When you push all those library reading lists aside, what book would you actually pick up? The question made me stop cold, the same way Jasmine's had. A whole life in the library had been a life spent reading for other people, reading to choose books for children, guide older patrons, update institutional catalogs. But reading just for myself? I had to frown and think for a long time before I could name a few memoir writers, short poetry collections, and books about older women starting their lives over. Ethan smiled, looking oddly pleased. That fits you. You sound like someone finding her way back. Behind the counter, cloth-bound journals in pale colors were lined up neatly on a shelf. When I left, I was carrying a blue-gray one in my hand, chosen for no reason other than the need to pour down thoughts I had never dared name before. A few days later, a flyer hanging crooked on the wall at the community center caught my eye. Memoir writing class for people over 50. Write the part of your life that hasn't been told. The little tear-off slip I pulled from the bottom edge stayed in my coat pocket for 2 days before I found myself standing outside the classroom door. The sound of chairs scraping and people talking inside made my heart pound as if I were about to do something foolish. I had just decided to turn around and leave when the door swung open from the inside. A silver-haired woman nearly bumped into me. She held the door open and smiled. "If you're scared, then you should probably come in." Her voice had a strange accent, and then she shrugged. "Sorry, I always sound a little like my Belarusian grandmother." The truest laugh I had let out in days came out of me then, and it was that laugh that carried me over the threshold. On the first day of class, my hand was ice cold around the pen. I wrote 3 lines and crossed out 2 of them. The instructor told us to begin with a room that had changed our lives. The woman next to me wrote 4 pages straight about a kitchen in Detroit in 1978. The old man across from me wrote about the garage where he had learned his younger brother was killed in the war. And in front of me, on the blank page, came the image of the bright kitchen where Clara had called with her news. A quiet kitchen. Good news. And an invisible door slamming shut behind me. That night, my phone screen lit up. Clara did not call. She only texted, "The doctor said I need to avoid stress." 10 minutes later, "Daniel's busy all the time." And one final message at midnight. "I thought you'd be different." The words fell one by one like drizzle, not sharp enough to become a real fight, but cold enough to soak through. Beneath the blame, I could read something else. Panic. The clues were in very small details. The messages sent close to 2 a.m. The rushed ultrasound photo taken in a car with a seatbelt in the background and fog on the window, not the setting of someone peacefully enjoying happy news. Once she called, managed 2 weak sentences, then suddenly went quiet. "Daniel's home. I'll call you later." And then silence. I began to vaguely understand that my daughter's demands were really a trembling cry for help, carefully wrapped in the shell of control. And everything kept unfolding in the most ordinary way. I ran into Ethan a few more times at the coffee shop. One day he asked whether I had ever thought about rewriting the story of my life. I gave a dry little laugh. "There's nothing special about my life." Ethan leaned on the counter and looked at me as if I had just told an absurd joke. "Then you're exactly like the most interesting people I've ever met." He told me about a community mural project. Faces tied to things left unsaid. "You should do it." "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm not wall material." "The real reason?" A silence stretched between us. "Because I don't think there's anything remarkable about me." Ethan looked at me so directly that I had to lower my eyes and take a sip of coffee just to hide my embarrassment. Then he said lightly, "Sometimes people think they're nothing remarkable only because they've spent their whole lives standing outside the frame, taking the picture for everyone else." I didn't say yes right away, but a few afternoons later, I found myself back at the table by the window, slowly turning the scraps of my life upside down in front of Ethan, like someone sorting through old things that had spilled from a torn bag. There was no dramatic confession all at once, no movie scene crying that washed everything clean. I would tell one small piece and stop, change the subject, ask Ethan something instead. The next day, I would gather up a few more fragments about the library, or Thomas, or Clara as a little girl. Choices that had always been labeled love now sounded, once spoken aloud, like a long process of erasing myself from view. Ethan asked, "Are you angry at your daughter?" "Yes, and that makes me feel ashamed." "Why?" "Because she's pregnant, because she's scared, and because she's my daughter." "And you?" "I'm her mother." Somehow the I always has to come last. Ethan did not argue. He only quietly wrote something down. I think that's exactly the heart of the story. A few weeks later, the mural was unveiled on an old brick wall near the park. A woman sitting beneath an oak tree, an open book on her lap, pages lifting into the air and turning into a flock of birds. Not young, not wrinkle-free, but peaceful and full of weight. I had to stand there for a long time before I could believe that face carried traces of mine. Beside it were the words, "It's never too late to write the untold part of your life." A small piece about it ran in the local paper. Someone shared it online. I barely noticed until the next afternoon when Clara called. She did not ask whether I was happy. She did not say the mural looked beautiful. The first thing out of her mouth was, "What kind of stunt are you pulling, Mom?" I sat up straight in my armchair. "What are you talking about?" "That article, that mural. What were you thinking?" My coworkers saw it. "So?" Clara let out a dry laugh. "So? You're in the paper looking like some woman who's finding herself or breaking free or whatever, while I'm pregnant, drowning in everything over here, and you're out there turning yourself into some kind of art piece in the middle of the street?" Hearing the word art piece come out of her mouth made me feel both sad and strangely distant from her. To Clara, everything seemed to exist only as a surface. The way people looked at it, the way the story could be told neatly enough on the outside to hide the cracks underneath. "I'm not doing anything against you," I said. "I just agreed to let someone paint me." "That's exactly the problem. Do you have any idea what people are going to think when they see you doing this right when I need you the most?" The silence stretched so long I could hear the wind hissing outside the window. Then I asked, my voice dry, "Do you really need me, or do you just need someone to carry the weight so your life doesn't fall apart?" The line went dead silent. One ragged breath came through the anger. "Clara, come down here." Her voice changed completely, no longer sharp but exhausted and frayed. "I'm not okay." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone hard. This had always been my weakest point. The second my daughter showed even one real wound, every instinct in me wanted to run toward it and patch it up at any cost. But this time, I looked at the mural in the newspaper and said, "I'll come. But I'm coming to see what's really going on." San Jose greeted me with blinding, bone-dry sunlight. Clara's house was too beautiful for its own good. Spotless, minimal, expensive. But the second I set my suitcase down in the kitchen, the cracks showed themselves. 3 open bottles of vitamins, 2 coffee cups with a film on top, a sink crowded with dishes. Exhaustion is not loud. It hides in the air. Clara hugged me, her body warm and stiff. She had lost weight, but her belly had already begun to show, a clear presence in the middle of all her weariness. Daniel stayed polite, asking about the flight, offering tea, making small talk, but his eyes were fixed on some invisible screen running in his head. At dinner the first night, the sound of an email alert at 9:30 p.m. made Clara jump so hard she dropped her fork trying to grab her phone. "Let me see," Daniel said, his voice low but pulled tight. "No, I can look at it myself." No one explained. The room went so silent that even breathing sounded too loud. On the second night, walking down the hallway, I heard them arguing behind the closed door. No yelling, no things breaking. Every word was being strangled before it could get out, like someone tightening a hand around the throat of a living creature. On the morning of the third day, one phone call drained all the color from Clara's face right at the breakfast table. She picked up and hurried out to the patio. Through the glass door, I saw her hand clamp down over her stomach, her head bent low. Daniel sat perfectly still, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. When she came back in, Clara forced a smile. "It's just work stuff, Mom." I said nothing. Close to midnight, I heard the soft slap of slippers in the hallway. Clara stood in my doorway, bare-faced, hair tied back crookedly, looking small and worn down. "Are you awake?" "I'm here." She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands laced together. "Daniel is under investigation." The first cut always hurts the most. It wasn't some huge public scandal, but it was enough to make investors pull funding, enough to make people inside the company start blaming each other, and enough for the press to begin smelling blood. "Do Daniel's parents know yet?" "They do, Mom." "What did they say?" "They want to protect appearances, protect this marriage, protect the baby, Protect everything so it still looks fine to other people. And what about you?" She went silent. The kind of silence that answered everything. In the days that followed, the invisible net pressing down on that house became impossible to miss. It wasn't just Daniel's trouble. It was an entire machine built on appearances. The house, the reputation, the tea parties where people smiled while their eyes kept watch on each other. And Clara was trapped in the middle of it, with her belly growing bigger. One evening, while Daniel still wasn't home, Clara stood in the kitchen looking numb. She was eating grapes with no expression on her face. I asked if she had been sleeping, and she let out a bitter laugh. "You know what, Mom? I thought once I got pregnant everything would just fall into place, like I'd suddenly know what was worth holding on to and what wasn't. But no, it's all just gotten scarier." Looking at her tense shoulders and the way her fingers gripped that glass bowl, my anger softened into sympathy. But sympathy did not mean I was going to give in. On the 5th night, the conflict finally broke open. It started with something small. Clara was sitting in the middle of a mess of appointments with doctors, lawyers, and PR consultants. I quietly said, "Maybe you should see a therapist on your own." She snapped her head up, looking at me like I had just betrayed her. "I need you," she said through clenched teeth. "I know. No, you don't. If you did, you'd understand how hard I'm holding everything together right now." I sat down across from her, lowering my voice. "Clara, I am here, but you keep talking like I'm supposed to carry all of this by myself. Because there are some things I cannot carry for you." She shot to her feet. "You gave up your whole career for me back then, so why can't you do that now for your grandchild?" The words drove straight into my chest. That was exactly the way of thinking I had built with my own hands over decades, through sacrifices I had once believed were the right thing. And because I did that, I understand now that it wasn't real love. Clara froze, her face burning red with anger. "So my whole childhood was a mistake?" "No." "Then what are you trying to say?" "Love does not mean destroying yourself. That's ridiculous." She twisted into a crooked smile. "Easy to say, since you're not the one paying the price right now. You think I haven't paid a price? If you have, then why are you still trying to leave? Saying no is not the same as abandoning you. To me, it is." We both stood there in silence. Clara's eyes were red, her lips trembling, but she still pressed them tight with that stubborn pride. She was terrified. She was being crushed. And yet she was still using the exact language she had learned in my house. If you love someone, you stay until there is nothing left of you. That was the hardest truth to swallow. I was not just the victim of this pattern. I was the one who had passed it down. I think a lot of mothers are like me. They believe they are teaching their daughters love, without realizing their daughters are also learning how to abandon themselves. I stayed in San Jose for another week. During those 7 days, I cooked, drove her to appointments, cleaned up the corners of that messy kitchen. Some nights, even the bathroom faucet running full blast could not cover the sound of her choking back sobs. But the next morning, Clara would appear perfect again. Cashmere sweater, hair neatly tied back, pale pink lips, as if nothing had happened. I helped with everything I could, but I did not change my mind. I was going back to Portland. I was not selling the house. "I'm not moving here, and what you absolutely do not need is another woman putting her whole life aside for you." At the airport that morning, Clara held me longer than she had when I arrived. No apology was spoken, and I did not force one. 2 women stood in that cold, bright parking garage, holding each other with a love that still had plenty of sharp edges in it. "We'll be okay," she said. I nodded, even though somewhere deep inside me there was a quiet doubt. Portland welcomed me home with rain. When I opened the door, the smell of old wood and dry tea rushed out like a long exhale after too many days of holding everything in. Whitman circled around my legs. In the middle of the living room, my suitcase still sat half unpacked by the doorway, and a thought flashed through me, worn clear by time. If I keep spending my life reacting to other people's lives, I will die without ever knowing what mine was supposed to look like. 3 days later, I started cleaning out the garage. There was no big organization plan, no grand business vision. It was simply the act of clearing out a room that had been stuffed with old Christmas decorations, dusty boxes of books, broken chairs and leftover scraps of wood, things I had kept only because I had never been brave enough to throw them away. Cleaning that room felt like cleaning out my own mind. Dust everywhere, my back aching, paint on my hands. I kept an old wooden table, added 3 mismatched chairs, an electric kettle, a few bookshelves, and a bulletin board. Jasmine came over to help hang curtains. Ethan brought me a small potted plant. The Belarusian woman from my writing class lent me 2 desk lamps. I named the room the Unfinished Chapter. The first gathering had only 3 people. Helen, a widow, stayed less than 20 minutes before asking to leave early. I'm not used to telling my story to strangers. Marisol, fresh out of a divorce, spent the whole time squeezing the lid of her coffee cup and managed to say exactly 2 sentences. The third was a 72-year-old woman who had been thinking about enrolling in community college, but was afraid the kids would laugh at her. Awkwardness filled the room. Clumsy opening remarks like, "Thank you all for coming," sounded like the start of a neighborhood meeting. There was nothing dramatic about it. No big crying, no shocking revelations. By the end of that first gathering, I was sure none of them would come back. But in the kitchen, while I washed the teacups that still held a little warmth, something quiet and bright came over me. I was doing something without asking anyone's permission. The next week, 2 more people came. Then 1 more after that. Until one day, a woman who had spent her whole life devoted to her husband and children and now had no one left, sat in the middle of the room and asked, "If I'm no longer useful to anyone, then who am I?" Questions like that were what turned that cramped garage into a place where people could breathe. The Unfinished Chapter kept growing that way, slowly but honestly. People did not come there to show off some polished version of themselves for social media. They came with unbrushed hair, dark circles under their eyes, stories that still caught in their throats, and desires that sounded unfamiliar even to the person saying them out loud. We drank tea, wrote a few lines, told a little truth, and then sat quietly together when nobody knew what else to say. Then one rainy night, close to midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 knocks, not loud, but urgent. Whitman jumped up, barking hoarsely. I hurriedly threw a cardigan over my shoulders, my chest tightening with that familiar instinct of a mother who knows too well that phone calls at this hour rarely bring good news. I opened the door. Clara was standing there. Her pregnancy was much further along now. Her hair was stuck to her cheeks from the rain. Mascara was smeared beneath her eyes. One hand pulled a suitcase, the other wrapped protectively around her stomach like she was holding it in place. That familiar face had none of its usual polish left. What stood in front of me now was simply an exhausted woman. "Mom, let me come in." I just stepped aside and made room. Clara came in carrying the smell of cold rain, airport air, and the dust of travel on her clothes. I handed her a dry towel, turned the kettle back on. When she bent down to take off her shoes, I rested my hand lightly on her back for just a second. And in that second, I felt my own hand trembling, out of love, out of fear, and because somewhere in me, her words from before were still there like a cut that had never closed. "I didn't think you put yourself first like this." It was almost an hour later, after the heat had faded from the tea, before Clara finally started talking. Daniel had been having an affair. Not a drunken one-night mistake, a months-long affair. Emails, hotel reservations, one text sent to the wrong person. The coldest part of the evidence was not the confession. It was the precision, the planned-out time slots. The love divided neatly between 2 women. Cracks no one could deny. "His family told me to keep quiet," Clara said, staring down at the wooden table. "At least until after the baby is born. For the baby. For appearances. Because making noise right now doesn't help anyone." "And Daniel?" "He cried." He apologized, blamed stress, blamed everything spinning out of control, and said he still loves me. Then she looked up at me. "Do you know what the worst part was?" I shook my head. He said, "You're strong. We can get through this. For the family." I closed my eyes for one bitter second. That was exactly how Clara had once pushed me to accept things. Endure it for the family. Sacrifice yourself to keep the shell standing. Treat personal feelings like something disposable. And now that very thing was crushing her. My heart hurt for her, but that did not erase memory. I still remembered what it felt like when she had once looked at me like I was something that could be packed up and moved, as long as it made her life easier. I let Clara stay, not because I was that generous, but because I was a mother trying to learn how to love her child without losing herself. In those first weeks, Clara lived in the house like an angry refugee. The exhaustion, the back pain, the swollen feet, and the shame all turned into sharp little judgments whenever she lost control. She criticized the old kitchen, complained that Portland was too slow, said the neighbor's concern was just nosiness. She even looked at the mismatched chairs in the garage and asked sarcastically, "So what is this, Mom? Your feminist revolution?" "No, I'm turning it into a room." Clara rejected pity, but she still was not brave enough to admit she was falling apart. Until one Thursday afternoon. That day, there were 6 people in the group. One woman told a story about how her children were quietly arranging for her to move in, for fun, when really they wanted her there to watch the grandkids instead of hiring a nanny. Her voice stayed steady until suddenly it broke. She said, "I need you, Mom," like I'm somebody she only remembers when her life starts falling apart. The whole room went silent. Then from the dark corner, where Clara usually sat just to be there, came a dry little laugh. "At least you're still needed." The room fell completely still. Helen stopped pouring tea midstream. Ethan looked up. Clara was still smiling, but her eyes started to shift when she realized how much damage her own words had just done. They were not only cruel, they were empty. The 72-year-old woman looked up. Her expression was calm and direct. "Being needed is not the same as being used." The metal chair scraped harshly across the floor. Clara shot to her feet and rushed out the door. A dull slam followed. Then the sound of the car door shutting outside, swallowed up by the thickening rain. A year earlier, I probably would have run after her immediately, apologized for her, comforted her, and thrown a blanket of understanding over the broken mirror. But this time, I stayed where I was. I waited for Helen to finish her story. I waited until the sharing in that room had been honored. Only then did I step outside. Clara was slumped over the steering wheel, her narrow shoulders shaking with broken sobs. I opened the door and sat down. Darkness wrapped around us. Yellow lights outside blurred across the rain-soaked glass. Inside the car there was only the smell of mascara, wet paper, and the heavy silence left behind after anger burns out. I hate this place. Why? Because everyone looks at me like they can see everything. Maybe because they've been there too. I don't understand how I became like this. That question silenced me. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the answer hurt too much. I looked down at my hand resting on my lap. The fine blue veins, the age spots, the hand that had buttoned coats, carried soup, signed forms, pressed against my daughter's forehead, and also quietly put away so many parts of my own life she had never seen. Because you grew up watching me give up too many things and still call it love. I don't want to hear you blame yourself. I'm not blaming myself. Then what are you doing? I'm telling the truth. I have a part in this too. I kept going. I taught you through the way I lived, Clara, not through lectures. I told you to be strong, to respect yourself. But what you saw was a mother who always gave in, always stepped back, always called her own disappearance love. You grew up inside that pattern, so when someone needed a sacrifice for the family, you assumed that was just the natural thing to ask for. I hurt you badly, didn't I? Yes, I said. But the most painful part wasn't what you said. It was realizing that you truly believed it. She folded in on herself, both shoulders shaking. I put my hand on her back, not to erase everything, only to let her know she was not alone in that moment. On the outside, Clara was still Clara the next day. She was still irritable because I bought the wrong yogurt, still complained that the room felt kind of depressing, still turned bitter whenever the lawyer came up. But something had cracked open. She started staying longer during the group meetings. At first, she only listened. Then she started writing a few lines in a small notebook. Some days she quietly made tea for everyone. Some days she sat and listened to Marisol talk about her divorce, then went back to her room and closed the door without saying a word. One night, at 1 a.m., we met in the kitchen. Getting older teaches people to wake up for no reason at all. She was standing by the sink holding a glass of water. "I don't want to go back to San Jose." Then she went on. "I thought I missed home." But it turns out I only missed the version of myself I was there. The version that looked like she had control over her whole life. Then, more quietly, I'm scared to become a mother. Not scared of labor. I'm scared I'll teach my daughter to live the way I did. Wife first, mother first, a role first, and then leave herself for last. That was the real turning point. Not when she cried, not when she was betrayed, but the moment she saw the rotten pattern inside herself and finally became afraid of it. After that came reality, which is always messier than any breakthrough. Clara decided to stay in Portland to give birth. That brought lawyers, paperwork, divided accounts, and dry, ugly fights over property. Pressure calls from Daniel's family. Emails that were polite but cold as a blade. Daniel texted over and over, sometimes just one line. I just want to talk. This time, Clara did not ask me to carry it for her. She asked the lawyer herself. She read the documents herself. She chose her own doctor. Some days she was so shaken she dropped her phone. Some days she gagged right after hanging up. Some days she collapsed on the couch and said, I want to disappear. But then she still sat back up. Only once, after a terrible call from her mother-in-law, she turned to me and said, You being here is enough. Not do it for me. Not stay forever. Just enough. Labor started close to 3 a.m., and with no warning and no soundtrack. Rain lashed the windows. Clara stood in the hallway, face white, one hand gripping the wall. Mom! 15 minutes later, I was driving through the storm with her fast breathing filling the car and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers crossing the glass. In the middle of one hard contraction, she reached for her phone and typed a short message. I'm at the hospital now. She sent it to Daniel. She didn't block him. She didn't call again. Growing up is not wiping someone out of your world because they hurt you. It is letting the truth stay exactly where it belongs, not dressing it up, not blurring it, and never letting it drive your life again. The hospital felt icy under the white lights, thick with the smell of antiseptic and the urgent rattle of gurney wheels. Daniel showed up 40 minutes later. He had already been in Portland for a few days, waiting for a proper conversation. He had aged noticeably, his coat wrinkled, his jaw rough with stubble like a man who had forgotten to look in the mirror for a long time. Mom, Clara's in the room. I want to go in. She doesn't want that. I just want to be here. Being here and going inside are two different things. His voice started to crack apart. I was wrong, I know that. I'm not here to argue. The baby shouldn't be born into something like this. I want to do the right thing, at least this much. I looked at the man in front of me. Some people only look human when they fall apart, more human than the brand they spent years building. But remorse does not automatically erase consequences. Every decision right now belongs to Clara. Could you talk to her for me? I shook my head. Years ago, I would have stood in the middle to smooth things over, to find the best words for both sides. I had been such a reliable bridge that both shores forgot they needed to build their own way across the river. But that morning, in the cold hospital hallway, I understood that the biggest change in me was not learning how to say no. It was learning how to stop fixing other people's lives for them. I'm not doing that. Why not? Because it's not my job. He was about to say more when the door to the room opened. The nurse called for family, and both Daniel and I stood up at once. But just then, Clara stepped out. She had not given birth yet, only just come through a brutal wave of pain. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and in that hospital gown she looked strangely small and fragile. But her eyes were startlingly clear. When she saw Daniel, she stopped short. The hallway went completely still, except for the cold, steady beeping of a monitor coming from the next room. Daniel stepped forward. Clara. One hand went up, gentle but firm. No. He froze in place. I want to come in. I know you hate me. I know I have no right to ask, but I want to be here. You can see the baby after she's stable. Daniel blinked, maybe thinking that was a door cracking open. But Clara kept going right away. We are not getting back together. We are not using this child to patch over something that was broken a long time ago. And from now on, no one gets to make decisions for me anymore. I looked at my daughter and saw something both painful and beautiful enough to take my breath away. This was the moment Clara truly grew up. Not in a boardroom, not in perfect social media photos, but right here in this hospital hallway, pale with pain, hair damp with sweat, and still clear-minded enough to protect herself. Daniel lowered his head, his eyes red. He did not argue. He only gave the slightest nod, like a man finally understanding that some doors can never be opened again by late regret. A few hours later, my granddaughter was born, a tiny little girl, red-faced and crying with all her strength. When the nurse placed her in Clara's arms, my daughter looked at that small new life and burst into tears. It was not the crying of someone who had just escaped disaster, and it was not simply joy. It felt like something that had been building across generations, finally finding a way out. I stood by the bed, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the bassinet, and I heard Clara whisper into the baby's fine little hair, "I will not teach you to disappear in order to be loved." If you believe real love should never ask someone to live by forgetting themselves, hit like or share this story. And stay with me, because from here on, my daughter and I were only just beginning to learn how to live differently. I had to turn away for a moment to hide how overwhelmed I was, because I understood that what had just broken open there was not about who won or lost. It was about something wrong that had passed from one generation to the next, finally being dragged into the light and stopped right there. After that, life was still just as messy as before, but at least we knew who we were. That is the part people least want to hear, but it is also the truest. Clara struggled through single motherhood in a level of sleep deprivation no book can really describe. There were nights she walked the living room floor until 3 a.m. with the baby in her arms because the crying would not stop. There were mornings she snapped at me just because I folded a towel the wrong way. She would sit in the kitchen, hair stuck to her head, dark circles under her eyes, and break into sobs because she could not even remember the last time she had taken a shower in peace. I myself nearly slipped back into the old pattern more than once. I almost took the baby from her and said, "Let me do it." I almost started making decisions for her again about lawyer appointments, or texting Daniel back just to get it over with. My body had spent 40 years learning how to automatically fill every empty space. But this time, I chose to stop. Not always perfectly, but enough to make things different. Sometimes Clara said I was too rigid, and sometimes my voice still came out too harsh, leaving her silent for hours. But now we spoke more honestly, apologized more sincerely, and knew when to stop before it went too far. Daniel was still there, contained within schedules and procedures. Between us was a distance measured out by reason. Once, I saw him holding the baby out on the porch, his face buried in her hair, and I realized that sincerity can still exist in someone who has done wrong. But that sincerity does not have the power to erase what has already been lost. The unfinished chapter kept growing. There was no glossy sign out front and no grant funding, just a small room behind the house where women came to sit and did not have to apologize for taking up space. That was enough. Helen brought cookies. Marisol read aloud the piece she wrote about buying her first car after the divorce. The 72-year-old woman brought in her college report card and showed it off like a schoolgirl. Ethan stopped by now, and then to fix a light bulb, ask for tea, and get so caught up listening to the stories that he forgot to drink it. One evening, after I turned off the garage lights, I found a small note tucked under a magnet on the fridge. Clara's handwriting. "I used to think you changed too late. Now I understand that if you hadn't changed, I never would have known how wrong I had been living." That was all. Just that. I sat down and read it 5 times. I did not cry out loud. I just quietly placed my hand over that thin piece of paper that somehow felt unbearably heavy. The next summer, I took my granddaughter to Cannon Beach. The cold wind hit my face, and the stroller wheels sank slightly into the dark brown sand. The waves rolled in and then pulled back again, like the breathing of some ancient creature that had lived longer than any human sorrow. Clara walked slowly behind me, her hands in her coat pockets, her face no longer sharp, though not quite peaceful either. A kind of peace that does not arrive as a feeling, but as a way of standing your ground. I stood at the edge of the water and thought about Thomas, about the young woman who had loved him with all her innocence and courage. I thought about the mother I had been, about all those years I had mistaken love for giving until I was empty. I thought about that morning in Portland when my daughter told me she was pregnant, about the word no that had made me shake like I had committed a crime, and about the baby lying here now, opening a new possibility for a line of women who had spent far too long making themselves small. The wind picked up, and I pulled the blanket more snugly around my granddaughter. She stirred, her lips puckering slightly inside a dream no one could ruin. Looking out at the ocean, I finally understood the thing I had gotten wrong my whole life. Love does not mean pushing your own life aside. If you found something here that feels close to your own heart, please support me with a like, a follow, and a subscribe. Your presence means so much to me on this journey of telling these beautiful stories. I'd really love to know what state or city you're listening from. And have you ever lived through a feeling anything like the one in this story? Tell me in the comments below.